The restaurant was full that evening, dim lights, quiet music, and the hum of conversation filling the air. But one voice rose above the rest. A young influencer, phone in hand, filming himself as he mocked the elderly waiter who had accidentally spilled a glass of water. The laughter of his followers echoed through the comments, each one feeding his ego as the old man apologized, trembling. No one stood up. No one said a word. The influencer smirked, proud of his cruelty, unaware that justice was already watching from the corner table. In that corner sat a group of men unlike anyone else in the room, broad shoulders, worn leather jackets, and faces marked by the road and time. The Hells Angels weren't there for trouble. They were there for dinner, for brotherhood, for peace. But when the old waiter's hand shook as he tried to clean the mess, one of them set down his fork. The table fell silent. A glance passed between them, a silent agreement that some things cannot go unanswered. The influencer, still streaming live, turned his phone toward the group, laughing. "Look, even the bikers are watching," he joked. But the laughter died quickly when one of the angels stood up. His presence filled the room with quiet authority. He walked to the waiter, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Take a break, old man. We'll handle this." Then he turned to the influencer, his eyes calm but unyielding. "You like attention? You're about to get the kind that doesn't fade with views." The influencer's grin faltered as the biker leaned closer, his voice low enough for only him to hear. "Tomorrow night, you'll be our guest," he said. "Bring your camera. Let's see how it feels to serve instead of humiliate." The influencer tried to laugh it off, but the room's silence swallowed the sound. The waiter, unaware of what had been said, simply thanked the biker with a trembling smile. By the time the night ended, the influencer's confidence had cracked. He didn't know what awaited him, only that refusing wasn't an option. And so, as the sun dipped behind the city the next evening, the same hands that had once pointed in mockery would soon be serving those who had come to teach him a lesson, one far greater than any he'd ever learn online. The next evening came faster than the influencer expected. The message from the Hells Angels had echoed in his mind all day. "Tomorrow night, you'll be our guest." He told himself it was a joke, that they wouldn't actually expect him to show up, but curiosity mixed with fear and pride. The thought of saying no haunted him more than the idea of going. So, dressed in his best designer jacket and armed with his phone, he arrived at their clubhouse just as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The sound of motorcycles rumbled through the night, their headlights slicing through the darkness. He hesitated at the gate, his heart pounding. A man with a scar across his cheek approached, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "You must be the kid from the restaurant," he said, not unkindly. "We've been expecting you." The influencer swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, I brought my camera." The biker smirked. "Good. You'll need it." Inside, the clubhouse wasn't what he expected. The walls were lined with photos, brothers lost, families helped, lives changed. It wasn't chaos, it was community. The men and women there greeted each other with respect, laughter, and warmth that didn't need to be broadcast for likes. It was a kind of authenticity he had never known, and for the first time in a long time, he fell out of place without a screen between himself and the world. The leader of the group, a tall man with silver hair and eyes that carried decades of stories, stood in motion for him to come forward. "You humiliated a man who's worked his whole life serving others," he said calmly. "So tonight, you'll serve us. Not as punishment, but as a lesson." The influencer blinked, unsure if he should laugh or apologize. "Don't worry," the leader added. "You'll be fine. But this time, the camera doesn't make you special. Your actions do." And so it began. The influencer was handed an apron and guided to the kitchen, where the same elderly waiter stood, his expression unreadable. The biker leader nodded toward the man. "He'll teach you what real service looks like." The influencer's face flushed with shame. For the first time in his life, the spotlight didn't feel flattering. It felt heavy. The hours that followed tested him in ways no online challenge ever had. The influencer struggled with trays, fumbled with orders, and endured the laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that came from watching someone learn humility. The old waiter, patient and calm, guided him through it. "It's not about perfection," the man said softly. "It's about respect. People remember how you treat them, not what you post." Those words struck deeper than the influencer expected. As the night went on, something shifted. The influencer started to notice things he had ignored his whole life. The way the bikers said thank you after every meal, how they treated the old waiter with genuine kindness, how they cleaned up their own messes without being told. There was no hierarchy here, no audience to impress. Just people who lived by a code: respect, loyalty, and honesty. When the leader called for a toast, everyone stood. The influencer hesitated until the old waiter gave him a nod. "Go on," he whispered. "You've earned a seat." The young man joined them, still wearing the apron, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his glass. The leader raised his voice over the hum of the room. "To the man who reminded us what pride can do and what humility can fix." The room erupted in applause. But this time, it wasn't for a performance. It was for change. The influencer lowered his glass, speechless. No one mocked him. No one shamed him. They had shown him something far more powerful: accountability without cruelty, correction without hate. It was the kind of lesson no comment section or follower count could ever teach. As the night drew to a close, the old waiter approached him once more. "You've got a lot of eyes on you," he said quietly. "Maybe next time, use them to lift someone up instead of tearing them down." The influencer nodded, his throat tight. He knew he would never forget those words, or the night when the world he thought he knew was turned upside down by men the internet had always misunderstood. The ride home that night felt longer than usual. The influencer didn't record a single second of it. His phone, usually glued to his hand, stayed silent in his pocket. The echo of the night's events replayed in his head: the warmth in the biker's laughter, the calm in the old waiter's voice, the way humility had replaced his arrogance without anyone needing to humiliate him back. For the first time in years, the silence around him wasn't lonely. It was necessary. He parked outside his apartment and stared at his reflection in the dark screen of his phone. The image that stared back didn't look like the confident figure his followers adored. It looked human, vulnerable, thoughtful, and raw. He opened his app and hovered over the Go Live button, but instead of starting another performance, he closed it. He realized he didn't want views, he wanted meaning. The next morning, his social media notifications were exploding. Clips of his humiliation at the restaurant had resurfaced, going viral for all the wrong reasons. Comments mocked him, memes spread like wildfire, and the influencer's empire began to crack under the weight of public ridicule. But instead of defending himself, he went quiet. His followers expected outrage, tears, or drama, but he gave them silence. Because for the first time, he understood that silence wasn't weakness. It was growth. Days passed before he posted again. When he finally did, it wasn't a flashy video. It was a photo of the old waiter smiling, taken with his permission, with a simple caption: "I was wrong." The world stopped scrolling for a second. In a space dominated by noise, that quiet confession hit harder than any viral stunt could. The comments filled with disbelief, curiosity, and, slowly, respect. People weren't used to seeing humility online. It was real, unfiltered, and undeniably human. And somewhere in the flood of messages was one that stood out. It came from the old waiter himself. "Proud of you, son. Keep serving where it matters." The influencer stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Thank you for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it." And that's when he understood. Forgiveness isn't given to make the guilty comfortable. It's given to make them capable of change. Weeks later, the influencer returned to the same restaurant. This time, there were no cameras, no followers waiting for content, just him and a quiet determination to make things right. The old waiter was surprised to see him. "You're back," he said, a hint of warmth in his voice. "Didn't expect that." The young man smiled shyly. "I didn't either. But I owe you more than an apology." He insisted on working a full shift alongside the waiter, this time not as a punishment, but as gratitude. He took orders, cleaned tables, and even stayed late to help the kitchen staff. The customers recognized him, whispering and taking photos, but for once, he didn't care. Fame had lost its power over him. What mattered now were the faces in front of him, the people he could serve without needing applause. That night, after closing, the old waiter handed him a small towel and said, "You've changed." The influencer laughed softly. "You taught me how." The man shook his head. "No, life did. I just happened to be there when it started teaching." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men from completely different worlds connected by something deeper than words: respect. Later, when the influencer stepped outside, he found the Hell's Angels waiting near their bikes. Their leader nodded at him, a faint smile beneath his beard. "Didn't expect to see you back here," he said. "We figured you'd move on." The influencer shrugged. "I thought I had to go viral to be remembered. Turns out I just had to be decent." The bikers exchanged glances, impressed. "Then you learned the right lesson," the leader said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Keep it that way." As the motorcycles roared into the distance, the influencer stood there for a long time, the sound fading into the night. He realized that sometimes redemption doesn't come in a grand moment. It comes quietly, in the choice to do better, even when no one's watching. And though the internet would move on, he knew this story would never leave him. It had changed the way he saw fame, kindness, and what it truly means to be human. The weeks that followed were quiet but transformative. The influencer, once addicted to attention, now found peace in anonymity. He spent his mornings helping the restaurant staff set up tables, and his evenings delivering leftovers to the homeless nearby. The phone that once ruled his life now served a different purpose. Instead of recording himself, he used it to capture the stories of others, the people the world never looked at twice. For the first time, he was creating not for fame, but for meaning. One night, while wiping down tables, the old waiter approached him. "You know," he said, "I used to think young people didn't have patience for real work anymore. But you proved me wrong." The influencer smiled faintly. "You proved I was capable of more than pretending." The waiter nodded, his weathered face softening. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes the people we least expect end up teaching us the most important lessons." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that only exists between two people who've seen the best and worst in each other. It wasn't long before the Hell's Angels reached out again. This time, there was no threat, only an invitation. "We're holding a charity dinner," their message read. "This time, you're not serving. You're hosting." The influencer felt a lump in his throat as he read those words. It wasn't just a dinner, it was a test. A chance to prove that the man he had become wasn't temporary, but permanent. He arrived at their clubhouse early, wearing the same apron he'd worn the night he first served them. The bikers greeted him with warm smiles and firm handshakes. The leader clapped him on the back. "Good to see you again, kid," he said. "Heard you've been keeping busy." The influencer grinned. "Trying to." Then he looked around at the crowd gathering. Ordinary people, locals, and even fans who had followed his transformation online. This time, they weren't there to mock him. They were there to listen. When dinner began, the influencer took a deep breath and stepped up to speak. "I used to think power meant being seen," he said. "But now I know it means seeing others." The room fell silent, the hum of engines outside fading into the distance. "A year ago, I was lost. I thought kindness was weakness. But an old waiter, a few bikers, and a whole lot of humility taught me that the strongest thing you can do in this life is serve." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was heartfelt. The Hell's Angels, the old waiter, and even strangers in the crowd rose to their feet, not because of who he had been, but because of who he had become. For a moment, the influencer felt something stronger than fame, peace. The kind of peace that doesn't need validation, only gratitude. As the night went on, he helped serve meals again, this time by choice. He laughed with the bikers, shook hands with guests, and shared stories with people who had once only known him through a screen. Somewhere between the laughter and the music, he caught the old waiter watching him from across the room. The man raised a glass, his smile proud and quiet. The influencer nodded back, his chest tightening with emotion. Later, as the evening wound down, the leader of the Hell's Angels approached him. "You did good, kid," he said, lighting a cigar. "Didn't think you had it in you at first." The influencer chuckled. "Neither did I." The leader exhaled smoke into the cool night air, his voice low but firm. "There's a lot of noise in this world. Most people just add to it. You, though, you learn how to quiet it. Don't ever lose that." That night, when everyone had gone home, the influencer stayed behind, helping the staff clean up. The old waiter came over one last time. "You know," he said softly, "you didn't just learn how to serve, you learned how to listen." The young man smiled. "I think that's the first time I've really heard anyone." The old man laughed, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then you'll be fine. The world needs more listeners than talkers." As the lights dimmed and the last chairs were stacked, the influencer stepped outside. The night sky spread wide above him. The sound of distant engines faded like a heartbeat in the wind. He looked up, smiled, and whispered to himself, "Not famous, just grateful." For the first time in his life, those words felt like the truest kind of victory. Months passed, and the influencer's new life began to take shape. The man who once lived for validation now lived for connection. He traveled across towns and cities, speaking to schools, shelters, and community centers about the power of respect, kindness, and second chances. His words carried weight not because of who he had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. And everywhere he went, people listened. They didn't see an influencer anymore. They saw a man who had fallen, learned, and risen with humility. But fame, even redefined, has its tests. One evening, during a live interview, a journalist brought up his past. "Do you ever regret what you did to that waiter?" she asked, her tone sharp. The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in. The old version of him would have deflected, joked, or spun the story for sympathy. But this time, he didn't hide. He looked straight into the camera and said, "Every day. But regret is useless if it doesn't change you. What matters is who you become after the mistake." The words hit deeper than anyone expected. The audience didn't clap. They reflected. That clip went viral within hours. Not because of outrage or mockery, but because of truth. People across the internet began sharing it with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like." The influencer's follower count rose again, but this time, it felt different. He wasn't followed for drama, but for meaning. And for once, that didn't scare him. It inspired him. Still, the one person he hadn't seen since that night at the restaurant stayed on his mind, the old waiter. He'd visited the restaurant several times, but the man had retired quietly, leaving only his apron hanging on the back wall. "He said he was proud of you," one of the staff members told him. "Said he didn't need to see you again to know you'd make him proud." Those words settled heavy in his heart. Some debts, he realized, could never be repaid, only honored. That night, sitting alone by his window, he opened his phone and scrolled through old posts, the ones filled with empty smiles and meaningless captions. He deleted them all, every single one. Then, with a deep breath, he typed something new. "To the man who taught me that serving others is the only way to truly lead, thank you." And as he hit post, he felt lighter than he ever had before. A year later, the Hells Angels invited him back to the club for a reunion dinner. He arrived quietly, dressed simply, without cameras or entourage. The roar of engines, the scent of leather, and the laughter that filled the air, it all felt familiar now, like coming home. The leader greeted him with a firm handshake and a grin. "Didn't think you'd forget us," he said. The influencer smiled. "How could I? You were the first people who ever made me see who I was." The night unfolded with music, food, and stories from the road. But when dessert came, the leader stood up, raising his glass. "To the kid who once came here full of pride and left full of purpose," he said, "you showed us that even the loudest hearts can learn to listen." The room erupted with applause, laughter, and a few claps on the back that nearly knocked him over. But beneath all the noise, he felt something quiet and sacred, belonging. As the laughter faded, the leader placed a small box on the table. Inside was a silver pin with the club's emblem, a winged wheel engraved with the words, "Honor and Service." The influencer stared at it, speechless. "We don't give these to outsiders," the leader said. "But you earned this one." His throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." The leader grinned. "Then don't. Just keep living like you mean it." Later that night, he stepped outside into the cool air. The moon hung low, casting silver light across rows of bikes. He pinned the emblem to his jacket, the metal catching the moonlight. Rusty engines rumbled softly in the distance, but the real roar came from within, the sound of peace, of gratitude, of knowing he had finally earned his place not through fame, but through forgiveness. He looked toward the open road and whispered, "I used to think serving was weakness, but it's the only thing that ever made me strong." And as the bike started up one by one, their engines blending into a single heartbeat of brotherhood, he smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, the old waiter was smiling too. Months turned into years, but the lessons he had learned never faded. The influencer, once known for arrogance and mockery, had become a voice for change. He started a foundation in honor of the old waiter, dedicated to helping elderly workers, service staff, and veterans find dignity and support. The name was simple: the Second Serve. It began with just a few volunteers, but soon, donations poured in from all over the country. People who had once followed him for entertainment now followed him for inspiration. Every event he hosted carried the same humility that had once been forced upon him. He no longer needed to perform. He spoke from a place of truth. "I was once blind to kindness," he would tell the crowds. "But a man with tired hands and a quiet heart showed me that real strength comes from serving others, not yourself." His words weren't polished like the speeches of celebrities. They were raw, filled with pauses and emotion. That was what made them real. That was what made people listen. The Hells Angels often attended these events, sitting in the back with arms crossed and approving smirks. They didn't speak much, but they didn't have to. Their presence said enough. They had seen the transformation themselves, and to them, the boy they once called the kid from the restaurant had become something far greater, a man of honor. Every time they rode together afterward, the leader would nudge him and say, "You know, you're one of us now." And though he laughed it off, deep down, he felt it too. But even in all his success, he never forgot where it began. One evening, after a charity dinner, he drove to the restaurant where his life had changed. The old waiter's chair was still there, untouched, preserved by the new owner who had heard the story 100 times. He sat down, ran his fingers along the worn wood, and whispered, "I hope I've made you proud." In the quiet hum of the empty dining room, he could almost hear the man's gentle voice replying, "You have, son. You have." He stayed there long after the lights went out, thinking about how a single act of cruelty had led him to everything good in his life. It was strange, how the worst version of himself had paved the road to the best one. Maybe that was life's way of teaching, breaking us first, so we could learn what it really means to be whole. The next morning, he woke before dawn and rode out to the hills with the bikers, the engines roaring against the rising sun. The air was cool, the world still half asleep, and the road ahead seemed endless. As they stopped by a cliff overlooking the valley, the leader turned to him and said, "You know what I've always liked about you, kid? You didn't just say you'd change, you actually did." The influencer smiled. "Guess I had the right people to show me how." The leader laughed. "Nah, you just finally started listening." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light creep across the horizon. Then the leader handed him something small, a folded napkin. When he opened it, he saw the words written in shaky handwriting. "Respect is not taught, it's lived." It was from the old waiter. The influencer's eyes filled with tears as he read it again and again. Somehow, the man's lesson had followed him all the way here, etched into the last message he'd left behind. He folded the napkin carefully, placing it inside his jacket. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to chase fame because I thought it meant being seen. But now I realize the only thing worth chasing is meaning." The leader nodded slowly. "And you found it, brother." Those words sank deep, heavier than any applause could ever be. As the engines roared to life again, he took one last look at the horizon. It wasn't just a sunrise. It was a reminder that every day is another chance to do better, to be better. He tightened his grip on the handlebars, feeling the wind rush against his face as they rode forward together. The world moved fast, but his heart stayed calm. And somewhere between the roar of engines and the whisper of the wind, one truth echoed in his mind. The kind of truth that stays forever. The ones who serve with humility always end up leading with grace. And as the road stretched endlessly ahead, he smiled, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing the spotlight. He was chasing purpose. In the end, this story wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. A young man who once believed power came from humiliation discovered that true strength lies in humility. The biker's lesson, the old waiter's forgiveness, and the quiet road that followed all led him toward the same truth. Respect isn't earned through dominance, but through compassion. What began as a night of shame became a lifelong journey of purpose, a reminder that even the worst mistakes can become the roots of something beautiful when you choose to grow from them. The influencer learned that the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more empathy. Fame fades, trends vanish, but kindness, real kindness, leaves a mark that never disappears. He realized that the greatest legacy isn't built online, but in the hearts of those you've treated with dignity. And in learning to serve, he found something far more powerful than followers: peace. Because service, when done with sincerity, transforms not just those you help, but who you are inside. The bikers had shown him that brotherhood isn't about image, it's about honor. That the roughest hands often hold the gentlest hearts. That courage isn't loud, and compassion isn't weak. Somewhere between the roar of engines and the silence of reflection, he understood that a man's worth isn't measured by how many people look up to him, but by how many he lifts up along the way. And maybe that's what life truly asks of us. Not to be perfect, but to pay attention. To notice the ones the world overlooks, to give respect before demanding it, and to remember that redemption isn't something you earn once. It's something you choose every day. Because sometimes, the road to forgiveness starts with a single act of humility and ends with a lifetime of purpose. If this story touched you, let's stay with you. Leave a comment below and tell us what lesson you're taking from it. Like the video if you believe kindness is still stronger than pride, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us all. No matter how far we fall, there's always a way back, as long as we have the courage to change.